If you're a believer, then I assume you care what Scripture says, and for those who don't believe, you might actually find this particularly interesting too, so long as you remind yourself that everyone has faith in something, including you. If you believe you're standing on a ball that's rotating clockwise while revolving counterclockwise around the sun, despite the fact that you don't feel any of that motion right now, then that means you have faith in the modern scientific explanation for what days and years are. Now, I don't intend to be overly dramatic about this solar eclipse today at all, but I would like to, I guess, just kind of leave everybody with a thought to commemorate the occasion, if you don't mind. And obviously you don't have to believe anything I'm gonna say, just try it on for size, see how it feels, keep your receipt. If you don't like it, feel free to return it. My observation today is this. Today's eclipse is 1/3 of a spiritual sign that we are genuinely supposed to interpret, and I'm gonna give you just one of infinite possible interpretations, and since particle physics and string theory argue for infinite time-space continua with infinite possibilities between them, my interpretation is definitely right at some point, somewhere. The question is whether that's here and now. So, let's start with why we should ascribe any spiritual significance at all to an eclipse. Like, why bother? In Genesis 1:14, Elohim said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs." Stop right there. Right? So the sun, moon, and stars are signs that we're supposed to observe. Is there any other example of the sun, moon, and stars being observed by ancient Hebrews? Yes, actually. You're supposed to observe each new moon the same way you observe the Sabbath, but both are holy days. The new moon is the night that starts a lunar cycle. Let's put it that way. Isaiah told us in chapter 66, verse 23, "And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Yahuwah." So we confirmed that sun, moon, and stars are observed and that they're used for signs. Now, if a solar eclipse is a sign, what would it signify? That's the next question. Amos already told you the answer to that, I think, in chapter 5, verse 20. He says, "Shall not the day of Yahuwah be darkness and not light, even very dark and no brightness in it?" That's Yahuwah talking about what's called Yom Yahuwah. The English translation says, "the day of the Lord." That phrase, Yom Yahuwah, the day of the Lord, is a moniker for what we now call Judgment Day. Before we go any further, does somebody need proof that that's what that means? Can I prove that the day of the Lord means Judgment Day? Examples, Isaiah 13 verse 6, "The day of the Lord will come as a destruction from the Almighty." Jeremiah 45 verse 10 says, "The day of the Lord will be a day of vengeance." So day of the Lord means Judgment Day. Judgment Day is not a specific day. It's a time that marks a period of judgment. It's just like the Hebrew word chodesh, which literally means new moon, but also literally means month. New Moon's Day starts the month, but the month is obviously the entire lunar cycle, not just the one day. That's literally how that works. We just witnessed a solar eclipse, which means the moon crossed perfectly between us and the sun to block our view of the sun. The moon appeared to have no light of its own, and the sun appeared to be darkening. So the sign is darkness conquering light, which sounds evil, but it's not. Actually, it's quite the opposite of evil. The spirit of Elohim is darkness. Bold claim. I know. Can we prove this one? That the spirit of Elohim is darkness. Remember what the original state of the world was. Let's start with that. Do you remember what the original state of the world was? In the beginning, Elohim created the skies and the land. You remember this? The heaven and the earth. In the beginning, Elohim created the skies and the land. and the land was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And Ruach Elohim moved upon the face of the waters. The deep is a Middle English way of saying ocean, and the face of it is its surface, the face of the water. What was on the surface of the waters? Darkness. What moved upon the surface of the waters? Ruach Elohim, translated as the Spirit of God. It's just saying the same thing twice. Scripture's repetitive. The Spirit of God is darkness, and it moved across the primordial soup. That's why the first thing made was light. Darkness was never created because it always was. You won't find that anywhere in the chapter where darkness is created. It already was. Another example of darkness being the Spirit of God is Genesis 15, verses 8 to 13. Abram asks Yahuwah for proof that he's going to inherit the covenant that Yahuwah just told him about. So Yahuwah then tells Abram to do something that you need an indigenous perspective to understand. What did Yahuwah tell Abram to do? This is Kate Enkawetu Sonekriku. In the Creek Indian language, that means bloodletting sacrifice, typically performed by a medicine man. In American Indian traditions, if their skin is dark, they're alternatively called a witch doctor, prejudicial terminology. It's a shaman, or what the English Bible calls a priest. I choose to put it in Creek Indian terms, or tribal terms of some kind, because I'm almost entirely Creek Indian on my mother's side, and partly Creek through my paternal grandmother's line. Muskogee for the former, Hichiti for the latter. More importantly, an indigenous perspective helps because I think it keeps us from unconsciously glossing over or ignoring the parts we've been conditioned to view as savage, which is the same thing we do to Genesis 1:14, telling us plainly that the sun, moon, and stars are meant for signs. Abraham literally slaughtered a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a pigeon, because that's what El Shaddai required of him in this passage that I'm talking about. Notice, 3 of the 5 animals are each 3 years old, specifically. Those 3 animals are also the ones he let bleed out by dismembering the body parts of each one and arranging them in a specific way on the ground. He also kept scavengers from picking at the carcasses all the way until sunset. He's guarding the bloody scene for hours, letting the blood soak into the earth. That's when it says a deep sleep fell upon him. Not he fell asleep, but that the sleep fell on him. In other words, he was put to sleep. Why? Because of the blood ritual. Hebrew shamanism for atonement, healing, and everything in between. This is how this works. This is what happens. Remember, the Most High told Abram to do this. He's following instructions. That's the narrative we're getting. Genesis 15, verse 11, we're still in the same passage. Verse 11 says, "And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. An horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Abram," wait, hold on. Who said? And he said unto Abram. Who said? The darkness said unto Abram, quote, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance." So that pronoun he in verse 13 has no other possible antecedent besides Adonai Yahuwah. No one else is here. This is the Spirit of Yahuwah coming to Abram. This is darkness coming to him and giving him the prophecy of 400 years of slavery and affliction for his descendants. But Yahuwah withheld this message until after Abram performed the ritual. I emphasize the importance of the ritual just to get us out of the religious framework church has put in our minds, because that's what's making a lot of Christians hesitant to investigate the signs in the sky. If you witnessed Abraham doing this, you'd have labeled his actions demonic. But the 400-year prophecy was given in response to that ritual. And the prophecy includes judgment for the nation that afflicts Abram's descendants for those 400 years. A third example of darkness as the spirit of Yahuwah.
The spirit of God is darkness, y'all. And if yon blee me, read Exodus 20 verse 21. It says, "And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness, where God was."
Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where Elohim was. So Elohim inhabited darkness in their midst. That's strikingly similar to the manifestation of Elohim on Mount Horeb, where the Ten Commandments were given as depicted in Deuteronomy 4 verses 10 to 11, which describe the mountain as being inhabited by, quote, blackness, clouds, and thick darkness. That's a fourth example. Darkness is the natural manifestation of the spirit of Yahuwah, which King Solomon more or less said in 1 Kings 8:12. He said Yahuwah's natural dwelling is darkness itself. There are many more examples, but this should suffice. Why? Because 1's an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3 is a pattern, and I'm already up to 5 examples. So there's a general significance of eclipses, which is that darkness overtaking light actually signifies a return to the natural state of existence. Back to the beginning, back to the origin. Darkness is origin, pre-creation. Now, most Christians and Jews agree that the prophecy of 400 years of slavery and affliction was fulfilled in Egypt. It's not true. Some of you know it's not true. First chapter of Exodus, verse 5, quote, "And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation." Skip to verse 8. "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." End quote. Skip to verse 11. Quote, "Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens." Okay, so slavery starts right after Joseph dies. Moses is born 64 years after Joseph's death, and he's 80 when he leads the Exodus. Check Exodus chapter 6, verses 16 to 20, chapter 7, verse 7, and chapter 12, verses 40 and 41. Just do the math. From Joseph to the Exodus is nowhere near 400 years in Egypt. It's more like 144. You got me? Nevertheless, this eclipse that we've just experienced, this eclipse is a sign. And I do believe that sign pertains to the 400-year prophecy's real fulfillment. Not only that, it does have to do with Egypt, but not the physical location of Egypt. How so? America is the 400-year Egypt. America is the 400-year Egypt, right? Because what they were in was the 144-year Egypt. So America is the 400-year Egypt. You're saying, prove it. Watch this. From an ancient Egyptian perspective, first of all, a solar eclipse is when the light of Ra gets blocked by the dark of Yah. Ancient Egyptians called the sun Ra, and they called the moon Yah, I-A-H, as in Yahuwah. So ancient Egyptians called the sun Ra and the moon Yah, I-A-H, as in Yahuwah. The darkness conquers the light as it did in the plagues of the original Exodus, but this eclipse can't be seen in the literal country called Egypt in Africa. It's a sign only to the land from which it is seen. So what does this mean now? Well, remember earlier when I said no single eclipse communicates the complete sign? What do you need to complete the sign? Well, what do you need to complete your days, right? 7 crossings of the sun from east to west, with the last one being Sabbath. How many Sabbaths complete the Feast of Weeks? 7. Which year is the sabbatical year? The 7th year. And Exodus 13:31 said Sabbaths were a sign between Israelites and Yahuwah. So you often complete signs like this in 7 parts. This happens to be the 7th year. This eclipse is the 3rd eclipse of its kind for North America in the last 7 years. Yahuwah usually uses 3 of something to consecrate that thing, probably because 1's an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3's a pattern. It's a mark of intentional action, being deliberate, meaning it is confirmed that it is your will to do this. Remember, Abram drained the blood of a ram, a goat, and a heifer. 3 different animals, each one 3 years old. From the first eclipse in 2017 to this 3rd one in 2014 is 7 years. And the second eclipse was in October last year. For each one, there's a specific path across the continent in which the eclipse can be seen. So you only see the eclipse fully if you live within that shadow's path. But everyone saw the eclipse in North America to some extent. So think about this. If you look at the shadows of this eclipse and last year's eclipse, the paths tell you more than just that darkness will conquer the light or that a return to origin is coming. That's the general message being communicated by one eclipse. But the 2 shadows of 2024 and 2023 show you an X. Why an X over North America specifically? 3 reasons. 1, X marks the spot. 2, the X is an Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And 3, North America was prophesied in advance to be the next Egypt. Aleph, first letter. Alpha, Aleph, Alpha, Aleph, the beginning. This message is incomplete though, right? Because we're only using 2 of the 3 eclipses. Add the shadow of the 2017 eclipse and you've got the earlier version of the same Hebrew letter, Aleph. This is Middle Hebrew, which came before modern Hebrew. It's the bridge between Hebrew cuneiform and the modern Hebrew characters. And this version's not called an Aleph, it's just called an El, as in El Shaddai, which you call Almighty God, or Elyon, which you call Most High God. These early letters were deliberately symbolic. The Aleph, or at that time, the El, was an ox head. That's literally how you would draw the letter. The letter is in the shape of an ox head, symbolizing power and leadership. Many times when you see the word God in the Bible, it's actually just El, not even Elohim, just El. Now check this out. Check this out. We literally just went backward from modern Hebrew with these last 2 with these last 2 eclipses to ancient Hebrew by adding that first eclipse from 2017. By going backward in our modern time from 2024 to 2017, we're going backward in the evolution of the Hebrew letter. And El isn't just the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, but also the first letter of the word Elohim. That's why it's called El. It's for Elohim. El means power, and Elohim means powers, plural, or gods. But we translate both as just God. So the question is, why would the sign be the beginning of the alphabet? Why is that the sign? Because the sign is telling people of America that they will soon return to their origin. Maybe not all Americans, but in one way or another, that's what's coming. A return to origin. Let me show you what I mean. And again, I'm primarily putting these thoughts out there to ignite a train of thought for whoever's watching this, especially Christian viewers. I want to challenge Orthodox eschatology for you guys. Now, why do I say the sign is warning about an impending return to origin? Elohim is signaling judgment on North America, and that judgment will lead people to return to the origin. What's that about? It's about the fact that America is the 400-year Egypt, like I said earlier, and the return to origin is a mass exodus from this Egypt, the 400-year Egypt, much like the first exodus from the original Egypt, the 144-year Egypt. How do we know this? Because it was prophesied already. This matches prophecies that were already given to us. Before I show you where, we need to know what Egypt even is, actually. Egypt, in and of itself, is a metaphor for bondage, slavery, captivity. Why should we accept a metaphorical identity for Egypt? That might be what you're wondering. Okay, it's a metaphor for slavery, it's a metaphor for bondage, but why should we take that? Why should we even assume that's true? Exodus 13 verse 3, look at what Moses told the Israelites when they first got out of Egypt. Quote, "And Moses said unto the people, remember this day in which ye came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage." This is a pun. It's a pun in the Hebrew language. You can't catch it in English. They're poetically calling Egypt the house of bondage based on their word for Egypt, which is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim basically means double matzor, which is a noun. Matzor is a noun, and Mitzrayim is two of those. What is a matzor? A matzor is a fortress, but it's also another proper name for Egypt and a Hebraic derivative of the Egyptian word for kingdom. Why did they double it by saying Mitzrayim? Because you had Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Mitzrayim was a kingdom of two fortresses, that of Southern Nile and that of Northern Nile. The root word of matzor, though, is just tzor, which is a Hebrew verb meaning to bind or to confine, like a prison. So by calling Egypt Mitzrayim, Hebrews were calling it the kingdom of two fortresses that bind, the land of two binding prisons. To follow this with the phrase house of bondage is to then emphasize the confinement connotation using an unrelated word that invokes the concept of slavery, which is ebed. That word literally means slave or slavery. The land of the land of bindings being a house of bondage is a pun because it's suggesting that they're celebrated for being defended against invasion from the outside, yet the fortresses are being likened to slave prisons, as if they're actually better at defending against escape from the inside. So it's irony. So while our English translation copies and pastes the Greek word Egypt over the Hebrew word, the actual Hebrew syntax is poetically referring to Egypt as a slave trap. The house of bondage phrase that we see here accentuates this, but it's built into the word Mitzrayim anyway. Plus, this was a popular refrain in the Torah. Right as Yahuwah gives the Ten Commandments, Yahuwah identifies in Exodus 20 verse 2 as quote unquote, Yahuwah Elohim, which hath brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of bondage. Same wording, same pun, more of the same ancient prison industrial complex. Deuteronomy 6 verse 12, beware lest thou forget Yahuwah, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. I have countless other examples of this, but I'll let 3 examples do the trick here because, again, 1's an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3's a pattern. Now, with that established, and understanding that Egypt, even the word Egypt here, at least in the Hebrew text, means slavery, captivity, bondage. We've established that. We've seen the pattern. We know what's going on. There's a poetic use of this term going on here consistently. So now that we've established that that's a thing, and that that's commonly what they're saying when they say this word, we can go to Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. Now we can do Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. This is what the eclipse is about. You're supposed to recall this to mind today. Verse 68, and Yahuwah shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. End quote. This is not the same Egypt in which Israelites spent 144 years in slavery from the death of Joseph to the Exodus. How do we know it's a different place? For one, we know because Yahuwah says that the way they just traveled from out of the land, which is the journey on which Yahuwah spoke about every time he said he brought them out of the house of bondage, that's not the way they'll re-enter Egypt, Yahuwah says. In fact, they'll never see that specific Egypt again, Yah says. At least not as slaves, not as bondmen and bondwomen. Instead, They'll go into this new slavery, this new bondage, this 400-year Egypt by way of slave ships. And when it says, no man shall buy you, that refers to how Hebrew slavery was practiced. Hebrews had slavery in their own culture, but their slaves were indentured servants who earned enough to buy themselves out of slavery sometimes. At other times, other people would often pay a slave's debt and thereby free them of their remaining obligation to their master. Yahuwah is saying the slavery he's talking about will be very different. This slavery will be different, one in which that never happens, right? There's only a handful of ethnic groups on the planet to whom this occurred, and they're all called Negroes. The Negro ethnic groups are the only people in the world, in world history, who have experienced this, especially considering how this same chapter described it already before this verse. Read the whole chapter to get the full description, but let's just check the highlights, okay? Verse 25. Yahuwah shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. That's a global diaspora. Negroes were scattered to specific parts of Africa, the Americas, and Europe, yet many of them remain in or were sent back to Asia to this day, especially due to the Arab slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade greatly furthered the global diaspora. Negroes were the slaves in both those trade systems. Look at verses 30, 32, and 41. Quote, thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build an house, and thou shalt not dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof. Verse 32, thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand. Verse 41, thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity. So the slave master was prophesied to rape the Israelite woman, and the Israelite slaves would build houses that they didn't get to live in because that was the master's house. The Israelite slaves would sow crops on a plantation, but the crop yield would belong to the slave master. The children of Israelite slaves would automatically be slaves, belonging to the master rather than to their own parents. This is chattel slavery, a form of slavery that has been incredibly rare throughout human history. And these Israelites reached this slavery by being transported on slave ships. Look at 45 and 46 also. Quote, moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed, because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of Yahuwah Elohim, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded thee, and they shall be upon thee for a sign and for a wonder, and upon thy seed forever. So all these curses of slavery and affliction are meant to be a sign on the Israelites to mark them as the people of the covenant. That's part of the purpose of the curses, is that they serve as a sign of the identity of the Israelites. So these curses are the marker of the identity. This is what you're supposed to look for. These curses are also a consequence for violating that covenant. So they are a sign of being of the covenant, but they're also a consequence for violating that covenant. Look at verse 49 and verse 50. Look at both of those. Look at verse 49 and verse 50. Quote, Yahuwah shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. Boom. There's your national bird, USA. Quote, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. End quote. So the master nation would be people from so far away that their lands were considered the ends of the earth from the perspective of people living in the promised land. And those nations would oppress Israelites of all ages equally. Verses 54 and 56 actually say that, quote, the man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children, which he shall leave. And Negro ethnic groups are best known for absentee fathers. Quote, the tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter. And Negro mothers are notoriously mean to their children and even grandchildren. Tyler Perry has made a career off satirizing that fact. So this prophecy is way too specific to gainsay. It's way too specific to gainsay. The curses placed upon ancient Israelites is that they would be taken on slave ships into a slavery in which all these things were the case. The North American mainland was only one of the places where these curses manifested, because one of the curses was that the Israelites would be scattered all over the world to be afflicted and enslaved. The sign of 3 eclipses spanning 7 years that are now complete is a sign from Elohim to Canada, the US, and Mexico specifically. Yeah, specifically. Other lands receive other signs in their appointed times. This is our sign. And it's not just for black people or white people or Hispanics. It's for everyone. Elohim is telling North America that Judgment Day is here and that it will return the Negro to her origin. Back to Aleph, back to El, back to El Shaddai, back to Elohim, back to the covenant. Meanwhile, North America as a whole will experience harsh judgment. Deuteronomy 30 also prophesied this as well. The first 8 verses of Deuteronomy 30 say the following, quote, and it shall come to pass when all these things are come upon thee, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before thee, and thou shalt call them to mind among all the nations whither Yahuwah Elohim hath driven thee, and shalt return unto Yahuwah Elohim, and shalt obey his voice according to all that I command thee this day, thou and thy children, with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that then, so it's at that point that the following will happen. Once you do that, once you return to me and my law, then Yahuwah Elohim will turn thy captivity. This is verse 3. Yahuwah Elohim will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither Yahuwah Elohim hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out to the outmost parts of heaven, from hence will Yahuwah Elohim gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And Yahuwah Elohim will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do thee good, and multiply thee above thy fathers. And Yahuwah Elohim will circumcise thine heart and the heart of thy seed, to love Yahuwah Elohim with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. And Yahuwah Elohim will put all these curses upon thine enemies, and on them that hate thee, which persecuted thee, and thou shalt return and obey the voice of Yahuwah, and do all his commandments, which I command thee this day. Yahuwah is talking to the Israelites about the time, the appointed time in which Yahuwah will gather all the Israelites from all the countries they've been scattered to and return them to where they're supposed to be. That's what's going to happen. So in the end times, the Israelites will be gathered from the global diaspora, and their hearts will be circumcised. That's the new covenant, which is always mentioned in connection with this gathering of Israelites. The curses were on Israelites all this time, and those curses will suddenly be on specifically those who hated and persecuted Israel. Who hated and persecuted Israel. That's why it does matter which foreigners support the Negro and which foreigners don't. It's more concisely explained in Ezekiel 36 from verse 24 to 28, wherein Yahuwah said, quote, for I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of all countries and will bring you into your own land. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and ye shall be clean from all your filthiness, and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh, and I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk. I will cause you to walk in my statutes, and ye shall keep my judgments and do them. And ye shall dwell in the land that I gave your fathers, and ye shall be my people, and I will be Elohim. I will be your God. This eclipse is part of a sign of judgment, pointing to Israel's return. Elohim is about to lead the gathering of the Israelites, and North America will have to endure some things for that to happen. For Creek Indians, a solar eclipse is treated as a pseudo-Sabbath of sorts. We don't work, we practice silent mindfulness and pay homage to the sun and moon, both. It's just a way to acknowledge the sun. It's just a way to acknowledge the sign. Because, the Creator is speaking to you. When someone speaks to you, especially someone of authority, you show that you're listening. And this is just a way to show that we're listening, which is done out of respect because the sign is a communique from Hisaketu Mesit, which is the Creek name for the Creator. It means master of breath, because the Creator is the provider of the sacred wind that indwells all human beings and all living animals on the land, and that is the breath, the ruach that was breathed into the nostrils of man according to the Torah. It's all the same thing. In this 400-year Egypt, the last 7 years have seen Yah eclipse Ra 3 times, casting 3 shadows that form the shape of El, or the Aleph, the first Hebrew letter, the beginning of the ox head, the power that created all things in the beginning. The master of breath has given the signal. There are people of every color who understand the sign. People who are neither Christian nor Jewish, but ironically, all of this is a bit too spiritual for many Christians, even though it's all confirmed in the Bible. If you believe the end is when Yeshua HaMashiach returns, you're probably thinking of Matthew 24, verses 29 and 30. I have different views on the New Testament, but notice that the Advent you're waiting on in that passage is still marked by a solar eclipse. The sun darkened and the moon doesn't give her light, right? It's just reflecting what Isaiah 13 had already said about the day of the Lord. If we read verses 9 to 11 from chapter 13 of Isaiah, that's not what we read at the beginning. It says, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. And I will punish the world for their evil, and the wicked for their iniquity, and I will cause the arrogancy of the proud to cease, and will lay low the haughtiness of the terrible." That's the description of that is exactly what the eclipse looks like. It's exactly what the eclipse looks like. It looks like the sun just turned dark, and it looks like the moon is refusing to shine, right? And the two are doing this together. All I'm saying is, don't deliberately turn a blind eye to the signs. Don't be afraid of the spirituality that undergirds your religion. If you believe you're living in the end times, look for the signs. That's all I'm saying.